recently I came across an article that I thought was really intriguing, was really interesting, and it was in Forbes magazine, and they released an article talking about the 9 most challenging leadership jobs in America. And as I read this list, I thought, man, there are some on there that surprised me, and there were some on there that didn't surprise me at all. So I thought what I'd do to start off today is give you the list of the 9 most leadership-intensive jobs there are in America. These are the most challenging leadership jobs there are in America. Number 9 may be one that might not surprise you that's on the list, but where it's at number 9 might surprise you a little bit, and that is that of the corporate CEO. Corporate CEOs in America today, there are some pros to being a corporate CEO, and there are some cons, and there are some challenges when it comes to leadership. And this article would do that, would highlight, here's some pros, some positives to this job. Here's some challenges when it comes to, as it pertains to leadership. A pro it listed for the corporate CEO is they make about 250 times the average employee in their business. So you got some money to spare. A con is the challenging requirements when it comes to leading a large organization. I mean, imagining balancing the roles and the expectations of shareholders and employees and investors and trying to look long-term so that your company can be stable long-term, but also creating short-term profits. That's a challenging role. They listed number 8 as United States Congressperson. So I'm not going to say a whole lot about that. They're not the most popular people in the world. That alone would be a bit of a challenge. I mean, imagine having to manage the needs and the desires of your constituents, along with the needs and the desires of, well, the money coming in from lobbies. You know, it's a challenging leadership role. You got to balance those two things. That'd be challenging, sure. Number 7, editor of a daily newspaper. I can imagine, especially in today's day and age with the growth of digital technologies, that managing and editing for a newspaper would be challenging. On number 6, they listed as a mayor of any town. This would be incredibly challenging. No matter the size of the town, there's always different people that have different wants and different needs. And all you have to do is go to like a city chamber meeting or maybe a zoning and commissions meeting that I know you all love to attend those. Those can get contentious, right? Like the people that show up for those meetings, they're passionate. So that would be a difficult job. Number 5 is one near and dear to my heart, and that is that of pastor or religious leader. I can attest to the challenges in that, but I get it. You may be sitting there right now and you might be thinking, Dan, like really? Leadership challenge, being a pastor? I mean, you guys only work like one day a week anyway, right? Like, and all you do is stand up there and talk for 30 minutes. How hard can that be, right? Like, so I get it. Even though I only work one day a week, and even though all I do is talk for 30 minutes, this can be challenging. It can be difficult. Thank you, one of you. Yeah, right? Like, it's a hard job. We'll talk, right? It's hard, right? So it's challenging. And I love, in this Forbes article, I love what a pastor and a program director for Fuller Theological Seminary, it's a large seminary out in California, he had this to say about this role. He said, you're scrutinized and criticized from top to bottom, stem to stern. You work for an invisible, perfect boss, and you're supposed to lead a ragtag gaggle of volunteers, i.e. that's all of you, right? Like, his words, not mine, towards God's coming future. It's like herding cats, but harder, right? And then he ended with this, being a pastor is like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Like, and I'm just telling you, I can resonate with that so much, right? Like it's hard. They listed number 4 as a football coach. So that's a difficult leadership position. I mean, managing like players and expectations of the team and like underpaid journalists that are coming to talk about you. And then you have crazy parents on top of that. Like, that's challenging to manage all of that. Not to mention, during the season, you basically never see your family, right? Like, it's just always the expectations so high. When the team's winning, you don't get any credit. When the team's losing, you get all the credit, right? Like that's a challenging leadership role. They listed number 3 as second in command of any organization. And when I saw that, I called Steve and was like, I am so sorry, man. Like, right? Like I get it. He gets a double whammy. He's like pastor and like second in command, right? And an upside to second in command is many times you're shielded from some of the worst criticisms that come from an organization. But the downside is it's your job to execute the plans and the direction and the vision of the top person. Remember, because I'm only working one day a week. So if I get an idea on Sunday, guess who has to do it? Steve, right? Like he's the one having to pull this thing off. So that's a difficult thing. And then number 2, this one's incredibly challenging, university president. As I started thinking about the intricacies and the complications of being a university president, you've got students, and you got to manage student housing, and you got college students, right? Like that's difficult. Then there's alumni and faculty, and you have fundraising and budgeting, and it's an incredibly complicated job. And as I looked at this list, I wondered, probably what you're wondering now, what is the most challenging leadership role in America today? What's the most demanding leadership role? This next one, number one on the list, you get less thanks than like pastor and football coach, and you have more pressure than like CEO and university president. This, according to Forbes, in their article in 2014, said the number one most difficult leadership role in America is a stay-at-home parent, right? And all the stay-at-home parents said amen, right? Like, if you have a spouse that's a stay-at-home parent, you better applaud, right? Like, and you might be sitting there, and I get it. If you sit there and you look at this list and you're like, really? Stay-at-home parent, leadership challenge? If that's you, clearly, you've never been a stay-at-home parent, right? Like, this is challenging. This is difficult. There's been times that Kelly's been traveling for a while, and I'm like, babe, I got this, right? Like, I can watch the kids. I can take care of the house. I can work. Like, I'm fine. Like, I got this. And then, like, 4 days later, it's like Lord of the Flies in my house, right? Like, it is, those kids are crazy, right? Like, it is incredibly challenging to do this. And according to Forbes, they said this is tough. And I love what they wrote. They wrote, while stay-at-home parents may have the luxury of wearing comfortable, stretchy sweatpants uniforms, they said in taking optional showers, they may often face disregard for the value of their role, which doesn't come with pay. So you have this difficult job and you make nothing, right? And then they go on to say this. They say, the knowledge that if you do your job badly, you'll be raising the next generation of psychopaths and U.S. congresspersons, while it's been calculated that the value of your work is a whopping $100,000 a year, which actually has been based on studies, the amount of work they do, your overpaid CEO spouse flaunts his or her paycheck as a way of showing that he or she doesn't have plan to help around the house. And then, and I love this ending. Then the last part, they said, even if you do your job right, those little ingrates move on and leave you with an empty nest. Right? Like, that's what you get at the end of all of it. Your pension is they just leave you, right? Like, that's what you're left with. And I love this because it made me think of all the unique roles that every single one of us have. And each of our roles, each of our jobs, each of our lives have unique leadership challenges to them. But the thing is, it's not just as it pertains to our jobs, it's also just in life. There's unique challenges when it comes to life. If you're a student in this place, there's unique leadership challenges that you have to face. Maybe you face unique leadership as it pertains to your relationships, maybe in your marriage. Maybe as you get older, you have to care for an aging parent, and that requires unique leadership challenges. Every single one of us are leading someone. Steve talked about this last week. If you missed last week, I'm telling you, go back, listen to the podcast, watch the video. It was an incredible start to our series, Leadership Gap. And he talked about this idea that we're all leading someone. And all of us are leading someone somewhere. And he started with the most important person that you have to lead is you have to lead yourself. You see, we decided to do this series called Leadership Gap because we realized wherever you're at, regardless of your job, regardless of your role in life, we all find ourselves in a place where the leader and the person we are is not the same many times as the leader and the person we want to be. And what do you do with that leadership gap? What do you do with the gap between the leader you want to be and the leader you are? See, in this series, we're dealing with that gap, and we're helping find ways that we can close that gap. Like I said, week 1, Steve talked about self-leadership and the importance of leading yourself. Well, today, many of the topics and much of the content coming from today's talk come from a book that is probably one of the best leadership books I've read in several years. It was the most challenging, the most original leadership book I've read in a really long time, and it's called Extreme Ownership, How U.S. Navy SEALs Lead and Win. And I love it. It's written by two UFC. It's written by, they could do that. When you see them, trust me, they could handle themselves in the UFC. By 2 Navy SEAL commanders, Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, which I think if you're named Leif and Jocko, you have to be in the Navy SEALs, right? Like there's no more Navy SEAL name than Jocko. And this is an incredible book. Are there any, I listened to the audiobook of this along with reading it. Are there any like podcast junkies? You love podcasts, audiobooks? Yeah, a few of you. If that's you, I'm telling you, get this book and on Audible. Get the audio version of this because they read this and they sound exactly what you would expect a Navy SEAL to sound like, right? Like I feel like I want to fight like something like after reading this. It's incredible. So this book is so challenging. And it just so happened that I picked this book up a few years ago when I felt like our team was at this place, that we were in this challenging leadership place. And I picked this up, and it was eye-opening because they talked about things. The beginning of the book, they start with this concept that leadership is simple, but it's not easy. And what I mean by that is the concepts are pretty simple concepts, but executing them consistently is far from easy. It's like this. If I were to bring a barbell up here and put a bunch of weight on it, put 500, 600 pounds on here, and I would say, listen, lifting this is pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple, right? Like you just walk up to the bar, you grab it, and then you stand up, and you lift it. It's simple. But if you were to come up here and you grab this bar, you would say, this is far from easy, right? There's a difference between something seeming simple and something being easy. Leadership is not easy. But the principles are incredibly simple. And the principles that we're going to be talking about today are going to be pretty simple systems. You're going to hear these things and nothing's going to be some revelation. Oh, I've never thought of that. But the application of it is incredibly difficult. And you see, as I was reading this book, we were at a season as a church that I just felt like there were so many different areas that weren't what I wanted them to be. There were so many systems, there were so many parts of the church that I just felt like, oh, this isn't winning, and this team needs to do this, and I just felt like, come on, like, my team needs to do better, and this person, and they can do more, and this, and I just felt like, come on. So I read this book, and they need to get themselves together, right? And I wanted to read this so I could realize, man, my team, they need to grow, they need to get better. I'm going to read this and then give it to them so they become a better team. And then I read this in the book. The most fundamental and important truths at the heart of extreme ownership is there are no bad teams, only bad leaders. And I said, this book is dumb, right? And I was like, yeah, this is a stupid book. I'm going to get a new leadership book, right? I was like, and because the truth of that hit me square in the face. And I had to realize that it wasn't my team. Extreme ownership means it's on me. That it's my fault, that I need to own every part of the organization. And if someone on the team isn't performing, if something in the organization isn't the way it's supposed to be, then that's on me, and I need to own it. You see, the fundamental truth, kind of the base layer, the foundation of this book, is this idea behind extreme ownership. That leaders must own everything in their world. There is no one else to blame. And what I had to realize, I felt like there were these targets that I had set up that I wanted people to hit these targets, and they were consistently not hitting the targets. So I felt like, man, they need better aim, right? But this book talks about this idea. No, if they're not hitting the target, that's your fault. Because one, maybe you haven't clearly identified what you expect the target to be, and they're shooting at another target. Or maybe they're missing the target because they're ill-equipped. They're not empowered. So maybe it's on you that you need to empower them. Maybe you haven't given them the resources they need to do that. Then that's on you. Or if you've given them the resources, maybe you haven't clearly communicated the vision. Maybe you haven't said why it's so important that they do this. And if all those things are true, maybe you've given them vision. Maybe you've clearly outlined, here's the expectation. Maybe you've given them all the resources. You've empowered them. You've equipped them. And if they continue to miss, then guess what? It's on you because you've continued to put them in that place. And I had to realize extreme ownership means owning everything, blaming no one. Because you know what I like to do when I find out bad news? I like to blame other people, right? Because I'm human. We all do this, right? As soon as you hear something, you want to blame someone, you want to deflect it, you want to push it off on somebody else. And this is nothing new. We've been doing this for millennia. This is nothing. We all want to shift the blame to someone else. In fact, I love in the creation account we have in Genesis, we have this desire to shift the blame. You see, in the creation, God creates Adam and he creates Eve, first man, first woman, and he puts them in the garden. And it's this beautiful story, and he says, hey, listen, you can eat anything you want in the garden, except you can't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but everything else you can. Well, what happens as soon as we hear there's one thing you can't do? What do we want to do? We want to do that thing, right? Like, I know you. If you see the thing and it's like a button that says do not push, what do you want to do? You want to push the button, don't you? You see, I know you. You go to things and there's like a roped off area that says don't cross this line. You don't want to just cross the line. You want to like cross the line and take a selfie with the picture, right? Like, you're like, oh, I'm crossing that line, right? Like, we're all this way, right? And Adam and Eve, they do that. They go and they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then God's looking for them. He's like, hey, what's going on? And he comes to confront them. And he comes to ask them, hey, what have you done? And he goes first to the man and he asks him, hey, did you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And here's Adam's reply. I love this. The man said, the woman you put here with me, she gave me some of the fruit of the tree and ate it. Right? So God comes to Adam's like, it's her fault, right? And I love that not only does Adam like completely throw Eve under the bus, I'm picturing Eve like, thanks, Adam, right? Like, totally throws her under the bus. He also like kind of passively, aggressively throws shade at God, right? Like, he's like, the woman who you sent here with me, right? Like, Adam's like, God, come on, extreme ownership. You got to own this one, God, right? You sent her here with me, right? And he's like shifting the blame. And I picture God, he's kind of like, Adam, I'll get with you in a minute, right? And he goes to the woman Eve and he asks the woman, hey, what happened? Where's the breakdown? Here's her response. The woman said, the serpent deceived me and I ate. Right? So Adam's sitting here and he's like, it's the woman's fault. It's Eve's fault. And then Eve's over here and she's like, it's the serpent's fault. The serpent deceived me. And the snake's over here. The serpent's down here like, I don't know. I mean, the snake's like, I don't know what a snake does, right? Like, snake's like, I got nothing, right? Like, I can't blame any, there's no one around, right? And then we all do this, right? We all want to shift the blame. Oh, it's someone else's fault. Somebody else needs to fix it. Our boss comes to us and says, hey, it's not my fault. It's this person. It's my coworker's fault. It's my boss's fault. We all want to shift the blame. This is nothing new. So what I decided I wanted to do today is I want to give you some keys to help unlock some extreme ownership in your life. So we quit passing the buck. So we quit passing the blame to someone else and we just own it. So what are keys to this extreme kind of ownership where you say we're going to own everything in our lives? Well, the first key for you today is that it takes discipline. It takes discipline. Like I said, there's going to be nothing here. It's like, oh, I've never thought of that. These things are going to be simple in concept, but extremely difficult in practice. You see, the practice of discipline, this is hard. Getting discipline in our lives is nothing that we get excited about, right? Like the prospect of like, I'm going to wake up early every single day. And that alarm goes off and you're like, starting tomorrow, right? And you like hit the snooze button, right? Like none of us, that's not fun. I mean, come on, what real person likes to choose broccoli over pizza, right? And if that's you, I'm praying for you. You have problems, right? Like we want the pizza every time, right? Like it's hard to choose discipline. Nobody wants to wake up early. No one wants to be disciplined. But the thing is, choosing that discipline, that difficult thing of discipline, points our life in a direction that leads towards the direction we want to go. Proverbs 10:17 puts it this way: whoever heeds discipline shows the way to life, but whoever ignores correction leads others astray. See, like we've said before, this is about you, but it's not just about you. You see, your life, you're leading other people, so not only is it going to lead you in a healthy direction, it's going to lead everyone else in that direction. I love in the Amplified version of the Bible is just a version of the Bible where they take the Greek and the Hebrew words that can have many different definitions, and they kind of expand it. It's like this really wordy version. I love the way that it puts it. It puts it this way. It says, he who learns from instruction and correction is on the right path of life. And for others, his example is a path toward wisdom and blessing. But he who ignores and refuses correction goes off course. And for others, his example is a path toward sin and ruin. See, he says when we choose to not apply discipline and correction in our life, it's going to lead us towards ruin. See, discipline is actually good for us. It's this crazy concept that it's actually good, that waking up early, it's not this drudgery. I mean, sure that it is, it's hard, but what that does is that gives you more time throughout the day. Choosing to be disciplined in your health by working out and eating healthy, yes, it may not be what you want in the moment, but it allows you to live the kind of life you want to live as you get older. See, choosing in your finances to be disciplined and live on a budget and live on less than you make, that's not fun. It feels like, well, I'm not going to get the things I want. I'm not going to be able to buy the things I want. But it actually gives you financial freedom as you go down the road. I love what Dave Ramsey talks about. He says, that you should live like no one else now. What he means by that is by having discipline, by living on a budget, by living on less than you're bringing in. Live like no one else, because nobody does that. Live like no one else now so that you can live like no one else later, so that you can have financial freedom later on in life. And in this book, in Extreme Ownership, they talk about this concept that discipline actually equals freedom. It doesn't seem this way. It seems like discipline feels like constraints on your life, but those constraints actually give you freedom later in life. Which brings us to the second key, which is standards. Having standards and expectations in your life. Saying this is going to be what's expected. This is what we're going to do as a family, as an individual. This is so incredibly important. And for me, this second key here is the thing that really hit me in the mouth when I was reading this book. Because what the problem was several years ago is I felt like there were some team members and we had a lot of volunteers, and I was saying, this is an expectation for us here at Icon. This is the standard. Here's the expectation. Here's the goal. This is what we're all going to do. Here are the requirements. But so many people were unable to do that. So people kept missing the mark, and I just was kind of saying, that's fine, but guys, this is it. And I was preaching, this is our standard. I was preaching, here's the expectation. I was writing down, here's our expectations for team. And people continually not doing that. And I just thought, man, the team, they need to get this. Come on. And then I read this. It said, when setting expectations, no matter what has been said or written, if substandard performance is accepted and no one is held accountable, if there are no consequences, that poor performance becomes the new standard. So when I would say this is the expectation, and this is what was done every time, and there was no correction, there was no consequence, there was no conversation beyond that, then you know what the standard really was? It was this, right? If you tell your kids, hey, here's the thing, it's a value for us, it's an expectation, we're going to eat dinner as a family every single night, and then you don't do that consistently, then guess what? That's not your standard. If you say, listen, in our household, we're going to say that people are more important than screens, but constantly everyone's looking at a screen like this, then you know what the standard is in reality? That's not the standard. And then I read this is how they summed it up. They said, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. And again, I said, this book is stupid, right? Like, man, I hate this book, right? Like, I was like, oh my gosh, so this is on me too? So this is mine to own, that I got to even own this part of it? And I realized that I was going to have some difficult conversations. That what I needed to do is I either needed to lower what the expectation, just say what the expectation really is, what I was tolerating, or have some difficult conversations and let there be some consequences to that. That was challenging. I didn't like that. Disciplining people isn't fun unless you're like really sick and twisted, right? Like, it's not fun to have discipline in our lives or to discipline other people. I mean, Hebrews 12 puts it this way. No discipline is enjoyable while it's happening. It's painful. But afterward, there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. So it leads us to right living, having that discipline, saying, no, this is going to be the standard. There's good that comes out of that. It actually is good for you. Which brings me to the third key, humility. Humility, as I read this, it was intriguing, especially the way that the authors, Jocko and Leif, talked about it. Because I want you to imagine, in the Navy SEALs, it's the best of the best, right? I mean, it's the cream of the crop. These guys, if anyone has ego, it's going to be the Navy SEALs, rightly so, right? Like, I'm not wanting to mess with them. Like, they got to where they are, many of them, because they were confident, because of their ego, because of what they could do. And they talked about commanding and leading groups of people full of that. Right? Imagine leading an organization that is nothing but like type A, driven, huge egos, right? Like that's what they had to do. And they talked about the importance of humility in the midst of this. Humility in the midst of the battlefield. Humility in the midst of afterwards and talking about what's been done. I love the way they talked about it. They said this: ego clouds and disrupts everything. The planning process. The ability to take good advice, the ability to accept constructive criticism. It can even stifle someone's sense of self-preservation. Often, the most difficult ego to deal with is your own. So this is challenging. This is hard work to humble yourself, to own mistakes and say, hey, listen, I was wrong. That's what I had to do. When I had to go back to the team, I had to say, listen, this is my fault. And the ways that as an organization we're not hitting the target, that's on me. And I fully own that. I don't make any excuses. It's not on any of you. It's my fault. However, this is going to be the new target. And this is going to be what we're going to do. But I couldn't say that without first owning the mistakes. And I loved it. In the book, they told some real life examples of what happened on the battlefield. And one of the most unimaginable things, the worst case scenario on the battlefield would be what they call friendly fire. And there was a scenario that happened when they were in Iraq where there was some friendly fire that had happened. And afterwards, they had to talk about what had happened and go to the superiors and how it happened. And one of the authors, one of the commanders, realized it was kind of a lower level chain of command that someone had made this decision. There was unclear communication, and that's what caused this to happen. And he thought about that. He was challenged because it's easy to say, oh, it was their fault. And that's what many of the commanders did. But he said, extreme ownership means me owning it. That maybe I didn't clearly communicate this. Maybe I didn't train my team well enough. So he walked into his commanding officers and he owned it. He said it was my mistake. It was my fault. If there's any blame to go around, it all comes to me. That is extreme ownership. Extreme ownership is owning even the outcomes. You see, we're okay, like I'm going to own some of the inputs. I'll do my part. I'll do what the boss told me to do, and whatever happens, that's on him. No, it's owning even the outcomes. And I love what they said, the quote, after talking to his management, he said, a leader must acknowledge mistakes and admit failures, take ownership of them, and develop a plan to win. He said, listen, I'll own it. And I realized here's where the breakdown was, and I'm going to fix that. I'll do something about that. You want to be, if you're in a company, if you're in a job, if you have a boss, you want to become invaluable, start owning it and then coming up with solutions. Saying, you know what, this was on me, but let me tell you how I think, listen, I got a problem, but I'm also going to bring you a solution. I'm not just going to bring you problems, I'm going to bring solutions too. And here's my plan that how we can move forward. You see, that requires huge amounts of humility, of sacrificing your ego and saying, listen, I'll own it. It's on me. It's my fault. You see, because if we don't do that, we're only going to fall. You see, when we blind ourselves to the issues that may trip us up, we're only going to trip ourselves up. It's only going to hurt us. Proverbs 16:18 says it this way, pride comes before destruction and an arrogant spirit before the fall. So you want to fall? The best way to fall is to think it's impossible for you to fall. You see, when the moment that we blind ourselves, we say, no, I'm good, I'm fine, and that ego begins to take over and that pride creeps up, we're destined to fall. See, we've got to learn to be humble and own every part of it. And when there's a mistake where something happens, maybe it's with your spouse, and you want to blame it on them, and you say it's their fault, and it's this situation, and it's this scenario. No, you own it. So I'm sorry that I'll take that on me, but let's fix this. Let's move forward. So here's the thing. Here at Icon, we don't want you to come and just listen to stuff. We want you to go and actually do stuff. See, what's most important is what happens outside those doors, not what happens inside this room for an hour every week. So what I want you to do is I want you to look at this list, these keys of extreme ownership. And I want you to think about what kind of jumps out at you. As I read this and I talked about this, were there any things that were kind of gut punches to you? Maybe when it was talking about standards, you thought about your family, you thought about work, and you realized, oh man, I've got some standards that, if I'm honest, aren't really standards. Maybe when we were talking about discipline, you were like, oh, why did he have to talk about discipline? Because I have very little of that in my life. Whatever it is, or maybe as I talked about humility and owning the outcomes. Whatever it is to you, if something jumped out at you, I want you to do something about it this week. And if you look at this list, you're like, well, Dan, I'm just going to work on all of them. If everything is most important, then nothing is. So choose one thing. Say this week, I'm going to work on this one key so I can learn to own my life. Every area of my life, I'm going to exhibit extreme ownership. I'm done passing the blame. I'm done ignoring the problem. I'm going to own my life. choose one thing, find a way to work on this. Tell someone. Maybe for you it's wake up early. Maybe it's create a budget. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's have a conversation. Maybe it's to apologize. But you pick one thing to work on this week. One thing. Maybe one thing that all of you can do. The lowest hanging fruit in the world. If you realize that there's a gap between the leader you want to be and the leader you are, the person you want to be and the person you are right now. If you realize there's a gap there, this Friday here at Icon, we're doing a leadership advance. There's no lower hanging fruit than this. Show up on Friday at 7 o'clock here at Icon. Here's the thing. We realized this was so important for us as a church for so many reasons. We said, let's do a series focusing on this idea of the leadership gap. And then we're going to put on a special event where we're bringing in people from outside the state. We're bringing people in, a developer from Austin. We're bringing in a national coach and national speaker that's helped thousands of people. And we're doing this for you. We're not doing this isn't like a city leadership event. I've had city people in the city call me and say, is this like a city thing? It's open for everyone? And I said, listen, you're welcome to come, but I'll be honest, this is for our church. This is for you guys. A lot of the application of what we'll talk about is for you. I'm not even doing this for me. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'll be in the front row. I'll be taking notes along with you. I'm ready for this. I'm excited for this. But we're doing this for you so we can help close that gap. So I want to challenge you. Be here on Friday. This is going to be an incredible event to decrease that gap in your leadership. That's one thing you can do to say, you know, I'm going to own my life. I'm going to invest into myself. I'm going to invest into my future. So whatever it is, wherever you find yourself today, whatever leadership challenges you're facing, whether you're facing challenges in the workplace, maybe you own your own company. Maybe you're a corporate CEO, maybe you're a congressperson, maybe you're a coach of some kind, or maybe you have to manage the most difficult leadership environment that is, and that's the one on your living room floor. Whatever your leadership challenges you're facing today, do something to move you towards extreme ownership. Own your life. So let's go from this place. And maybe if we all did this, if we all exhibited some extreme ownership in our lives, maybe we could change our families. Maybe we could change our workplaces. Maybe we could change our community if we all decided to do something about it this week. Amen? Let's pray.